history and the way that we tell it is critically important to our understanding of ourselves and what's going on in the world around us now, the world that happened before us, and it casts a vision for what comes next. Who's writing the history, how the story is told, what gets passed on is critical to our self-understanding, to our understanding of God and our faith, and our understanding of the world around us. On a personal level, that sense of history and the importance of the narrative comes home to us as we tell the story to ourselves about ourselves. The messages that we get from our parents and our teachers and our friends as we go through our young life often settles in our brains and shapes us for the rest of our lives if we don't examine the story and the history. As a child, we may have been named the smart one, or the dumb one, or the fat one, or the one that couldn't get anything right, or the strange one, or the one that had to be perfect. And that story, that narrative of ourselves, gets woven into our consciousness. And if the story is one that does not suit us in our lives and in the world around us, sometimes we go to therapy to get a new story. That's one of the functions of mental health counseling. The way we tell the story, the history, the regular actors in it, whatever school of therapy you do, you're always going to touch on those fundamental narratives and the thinking that goes behind it. So different modes of thinking will shape the way we see ourselves. Similarly, on a familial level, we tell stories of our history. There are certain characters in our family's history that are lifted up as our ancestors and forebears, whose shadows get cast way into the future. And similarly, there are characters that fade out, who are not remembered, or secret characters that we feel and don't know. As some of you may know, 23andMe has been an interesting experience in my own life. I found out that I have siblings that I did not know ever existed. So my history and my sense of my family and who is in my family has shifted radically, and I don't like it. I'm just going to tell you right now. But that sense of story and how we say it and who is in it matters. How we tell the story of our faith life and the life of our church matters. The pieces that we lift up, the pieces that we shadow, the pieces that we only allude to obliquely, also shapes our identity and how we act, what we think is important. When I was first becoming an Episcopalian, one of the things that was attractive to me, I came out of a Church of God background, one of the things that people lifted up to me in the early 80s was that the Episcopal Church never separated during the Civil War. We wore that as a badge of honor. That was the way we told the story of ourselves. Those Baptists, those Presbyterians, the Methodists, they couldn't hang together during the Civil War because so many of them owned slaves, and we just split on the racial line. But the Episcopal Church did not split. No siree, we did not. It was a badge of pride. And it was a way for us to tell ourselves that, no, we were not racist. We were always anti-abolitionist and on the right side of the story. I came to learn much later, not in Episcopal seminary, mind you, that the way we stayed together was we didn't have General Convention during the Civil War. Now, you could argue that we knew that that was going to be a hot story and that we didn't have the tools to deal with the conflict, and so we didn't meet. But the other way of telling that story is we couldn't handle the conflict and we didn't deal with the issue. So rather than kind of dealing with it then, we deferred and we told the story differently so that when the Union won, we could be righteous. But that was not what happened, right? The way we tell the story matters. History matters for us collectively as a nation, too. Can I get a word on that? An amen? I think part of the issue that's going on right now is we're doing battle around CRT and book banning, and all of those challenges have to do with whose story are we telling, who gets to tell it, and who gets to edit the story, who is in and who is out. And friends, it was ever thus. Which brings me to our lesson from Exodus this morning. Just a fun little fact for you. In the Republic of Texas, when we were a slave-owning state, this book would not have been allowed to be read by enslaved people. This was true throughout the southern United States. The book of Exodus was excised from the Bible. Okay, get your minds around that. Why might that be? If you get the story, if you get the history of this chapter, like where it starts, this is a deeply subversive text. It makes you wonder about the history. And the first thing that we want to hear is we go from Joseph, because we've been spending time with Joseph, and you remember Joseph goes to Egypt and he rises to be the grand vizier of the Pharaoh, and he's able to save his family and his people from famine that struck the whole world. The Pharaoh was so grateful to Joseph that he set up a space for the Hebrew people to live in Egypt, an immigrant community, if you will. And they added value to Egypt. They built cities, they were part of the community, they were honored because they worked hard and they were prolific and they were part of the community. That's the end of the story of Joseph. And then we begin today. There arose a Pharaoh, and this is the King James Version, who knew not Joseph. Didn't know the history. The Pharaoh didn't know the story. And so what happens? What happens to the Pharaoh is he gets scared to death because he thinks these Hebrew people are going to subvert his power and his affluence, and he immediately thinks in terms of enemies and power. They're going to rise, and if there becomes war, they're going to be against us. We need to be afraid of these people. And not only that, they breed like rabbits. Our numbers are decreasing, and their numbers are increasing. We've got to act now. And so out of his fear, he pulls in the women. Now, we don't know whether these two midwives are Hebrews or Egyptians. What we're told is that they're midwives, they're Hebrew midwives. They may have been Egyptian women that were serving the Hebrew community, or they may have been Hebrew women. In this atmosphere of fear that the Pharaoh has created, more and more oppression is happening. They're having to build more on fewer wages in harder conditions. Their imprisonment is at a higher rate, and they are ignored, and their needs are ignored. And so we get to this point in the story where how much harder, how much harsher can I be? Let's just kill those boy babies. Let's go to the heart of the matter. What's interesting about that fear is it keeps escalating, right? And so Pharaoh is not hearing the humanity of any of those Hebrew people that he is affecting. I wonder, is that the way oppression works when we become afraid of the others who have a different culture, who have a different story, whose history we don't know? I wonder if that can look like things in rivers. So he comes into those midwives to the Hebrews, and I want you to kill those children. And what's brilliant about these women and midwives and obstetricians and gynecologists are always subversive people. Word. We have some in our number. They're always about seeing life in the complexity of life and death. Because if you're dealing with birth and you're dealing with dying, if you're dealing with birth, you're dealing with potential. If you're dealing with birth, you're dealing with fear and with who should be born and how, and in what circumstances are they going to grow and thrive or not. These women are savvy. They also are deeply subversive. They speak the language of prejudice so they can pass. Pharaoh, we hear you about this rule, about killing those boy babies. But here's those deals, you know, those Hebrew women, boy, honey, it's like they're all having their 7th baby. They're just slipping out before we can get there. It feeds into his stereotype of these breeders. And he doesn't see that he's getting played. But the women do. The women know. And their lives thrive because they are fearing God, not the Hebrews. Their trust is that God is at work in this mysterious play of life and death, and that they have a hand in bringing that to pass. And they have a confidence that these are human beings and not mere products, and that God is present. So we hear tell of this baby who's born, this boy. And the language in the Hebrew is that he was good. It's not that he's beautiful. He was good. This might recall to us a lesson we heard earlier in the summer from Genesis 1. You remember when God creates the stars, and what is it? And what are those animals that get created? And what about those birds of the air there? And when he creates the human beings, they are very good. So this woman and these midwives are aware that what they are doing is this God work. They are bringing life in, and it is good. It doesn't matter if it's Hebrew or alien or imprisoned. It is very good. And Moses' mother, in the Hebrew, places her boy in not a basket, it's an ark. The word in Hebrew for Noah's ark is the same as the word for the basket that Moses gets placed in. The ark is a symbol of God's continuity of creation over time. The ark is the image of God not losing it when things are chaotic and evil and broken. The ark is the God's way of maintaining promise with creation, that it is good. And lest we want to just objectify those Egyptians and think that they are gross people and beyond redemption, and that they vote the wrong way consistently and are all about money, the Pharaoh's daughter sees this very good baby in this little ark, and she recognizes the power of life. And she calls him Moses because he came out of the water, and creation comes out of the water. Creation comes out of the water. The narrative is important. And the narrative is not a given. We create the narrative. We tell the story of history about ourselves, about our church, about our community. that history, that narrative, is constructed by human beings as we interact with the spirit and presence of God throughout time. This is so important. The history of St. Stephen's is a mark of that. We have a hard time telling our history sometimes as a parish. There are key moments that we will highlight because we're proud of them, but there are also chapters of it that are difficult to share. So, for example, one of the things that we will say in pride is that St. Stephen's was the first private school to integrate in Houston. And we're proud of that. The piece that we don't say is that we lost many, many white people when we did it, and the school closed. We were part of the history of Houston and the flight that happened, that was part of our history. We like to tell the history of how we were able to think ahead on acquiring properties, whether it was Clax Monroe signing his personal signature to buy the parking lot without asking the vestry's permission. We don't tell that history, we say that history. That's part of our narrative. But part of what we don't say about Claxton was that he was called to St. Stephen's in part because it was dying at that point when he came. And so risk-taking and trusting him was about letting it grow. Part of the history that we don't want to talk about is our relationship with a private school. And that is still one that we are struggling with, because our values are about common good and the role of public education and how critical it is and how many of us do that ministry day in and day out. And as citizens, it supports our life. And at the same time, those of us who interface with our parents and students at the school recognize that the spiritual formation that we're offering at our day school would be offered nowhere else in those children's lives if we weren't doing it. And it's also the case that our school is one of the few places where gender affirming teaching is happening. I had a former member of St. Stephen's reach out to me that their child is gender nonconforming to ask whether we still had scholarship money for children who are struggling and learning and becoming. That's an unsettled chapter for us in our history. And it intersects with the changing narrative in Texas as we think about vouchers and whether we should want them or not. I think another story and piece of our history is our relationship to place and space, and how flexible can we be about who we are. That's a chapter we are writing right now. This weekend, our vestry members and board of trustee members or trustees gathered to decide whether we would take this step of asking for developers to help us reimagine this property so that we can get the value out of our land to support mission. And it was a wonderful time of coming together and thinking and praying and working on narrative now, as well as projecting the story of what we want to be and who we want to be into the future. But friends, crafting the story is not an easy thing, because whether it's in our own minds or in between us, we see different things at different times. We value different things at different times. Power is differently distributed in any group of people. And so how do you listen to the voices that have been marginalized and may not be comfortable or allowed to be heard? What's the role of economics in telling the story? And who makes those decisions around what's possible financially? Because economy also impacts the way we tell story. So I want to raise all this up because in our culture as we are living today, there is an incredibly simplistic narrative going on, as if there is one story and that there should be one story, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the other danger is that there are so many stories out there that we don't have a common story that we can connect to. And part of our faith struggle and part of our faith formation at this time is to not let ourselves be Pharaoh, that we know not Joseph. And part of the reason this story in Exodus is so critical is that it reminds us that when we don't know history and we're not attentive to narrative, we are capable of amazing brutality. All of us. And so today, I want to challenge you to be thinking about the way you tell this story about yourself, the way you're telling the story about your community, and the stories that you're hearing from outside, that critical lens of story. And just be aware of it. Just notice it. And then I want you to also see what's your primary lens, because we all have one. And what will keep us human with one another and to ourselves is by being gracious and flexible in the nature of our lens. Brittle lenses break apart and make you see in fragments. Amen.